I'm just a guy who loved movies, and when I was 7 years old, I decided that's what I wanted to do, and that's all I've ever done. And at a certain point, I think recently, especially, people started noticing. But I've been just, figuring in my own way out how to do things and teaching myself how to do it. And I didn't go to film school. I just figured, I'm gonna make my own movies and do it stubbornly, independently, and all of a sudden now I'm here.
There's an industrialized narrative form drenched in a self-reflexive cynicism and strict adherence to convention that has emerged over the last decade that seems to inform most studio American films, especially genre films. These aesthetic standards amount to straightforward, airtight, and for the most part, inoffensive movies that more than dominate the zeitgeist monetarily, they also maintain a near monopoly on prestige. These standards serve both the general audiences, offering easy-to-digest narratives that, regardless of tone or genre, can be understood in their totality in one watch, and the plot hole-obsessed, let's call them movie reviewers, whose idea of narrative integrity is a moment-to-moment consistency buttressed by exposition and appeals to strict literalism. Creative departures from these standards are often dismissed as nonsensical, iconoclastic, messy, outright bad, boring, obvious, which is often a word used wrong-headedly, or, worst yet, pretentious. Now, it should be said that transgressing these aesthetic standards is not, in and of itself, some magical shortcut to an incredible cinematic work of art, nor is the transgressor automatically a singular authorial genius, but when it's done with a purposeful and assured hand, it can amount to some very, very interesting pieces of cinema by some very, very interesting artists. Writer-director David Lowery, whose filmography is so wildly diverse it's almost hard to believe at times, is an incredibly interesting and diverse filmmaker operating outside of these norms consistently. I mean, the guy responsible for the delightful, seemingly handmade despite its studio ties, Pete's Dragon, is also responsible for the beautifully realized piece of existential slow cinema, A Ghost Story. Yeah, it's crazy. Lowery's latest film, The Green Knight, is perhaps the best example of his willingness to subvert, invent, and explore in his own ways, despite working within the established framework of a well-worn genre. Just to get this out of the way now, The Green Knight is excellent. I mean, just spectacular in basically every way, and its excellence starts with the script. Based on the poem Sir Gawain in The Green Knight, Lowery has honored the source material well, while crafting something wholly original and fresh. Dialogically, the characters speak in a period-appropriate way that admittedly takes a little while to settle into, but once you do and you're able to pick up on the nuances, you'll see that there are myriad little anachronistic bits of sardonic humor woven into the lines being delivered. This subtle and sardonic brand of humor does not stop the film from feeling earnest and sincere though, which is quite the accomplishment, and I think it's attributable to a couple of things. One, the script and its ability to avoid taking cheap potshots at the source material to mine for laughs, and two, the incredible performances, which I'll get to later. The structure of the narrative essentially mirrors the poem, but the exclusion of conventional exposition and a willingness to break from the source material in certain key moments that I won't spoil are enough to keep people familiar with the poem, engaged, and interested throughout. The script is also incredibly thematically dense. There is just a lot going on here. One specific thing I'll focus on briefly is the upside down Christ theme, which is to say an exploration of a flawed Christ figure. To start, the primal scene for the legend of Sir Gawain is conceived by his mother, and due to the spiritual nature of the ritual, it's framed as a take on the Immaculate Conception on Christmas Day. For the sake of clarity, note that I'm using the term legend as an amalgam of journey and life. The two things are mixed in the context of Gawain as a character, illustrated in the scene in which King Arthur asks Gawain to tell him a story about himself, to which he simply replies, quote, "I have none to tell." He is without history, thus setting up the knight's challenge as his primal scene. It is how he steps into the realm of personhood, again, Immaculate Conception. It's also really interesting that the first line of dialogue is,
"Christ is born."
Further, the legend of Sir Gawain is created and premised on an inevitable sacrifice, a sacrifice that installs nobility in the character who chooses to embark on the journey despite knowing how it's going to end. There are plenty of other thematic elements in the narrative, like a real appraisal of the concept of honor, the inherent morally bankrupt trappings of ambition, man's inability to supersede nature as the dominant force on earth, the hero's journey, and so on and so forth. But I'll save those for a future analysis, maybe. Lowry has stated in interviews that the screenplay was only 80 pages long, which at first glance is kind of hard to believe, but when you consider just how heavy this film is on atmosphere and visual storytelling, it makes complete sense. Directorially and cinematographically, this film is something to behold. The framing and precise camera work are dynamic and incredible, but never invasive, and the lighting is probably the best I've seen since The Lighthouse. Lowry and cinematographer Andrew Palermo make great use of the Arri Alexa 6.5 and the prime lenses, capturing breathtaking landscapes and endlessly detailed interiors that make this film's $15 million budget seem almost unbelievable. This picture is rich and it feels huge, just cementing the fact that skill and craft matter a hell of a lot more than budget ever will. Staying with the visuals, a lot of the themes are simply shown using clever symbolism and cinematographic techniques, like a shield bearing the image of the Virgin Mary and Jesus Christ that in a close-up gets destroyed by a character Godwin encounters early on in his journey. There's also an image of a decapitated crucifix that shows up in a very interesting point of the film, and Godwin has a Christ-like portrait made that happens to be upside down at the point of its inception that shows up again at a pivotal point in the film positioned differently, thus strengthening the upside down Christ theme. It's really interesting. The color green is also a thematic symbol in the film, and since its significance is really hard to miss, I'll just shut up about it, but it's a good thing to think about while you're watching, especially if you're watching for a second time. The score by Daniel Hart is phenomenal. The music is beautiful, haunting, and most importantly, memorable, and it genuinely feels like a vital element of the film. There are scenes that I could not imagine working without this specific score. Also worth mentioning is the sound design. It's just great. It uses silence in a way that not enough films are bold enough to do, enhancing the viewing experience exponentially by way of contrast. It also incorporates the score in ways that blur the line between diegetic and non-diegetic. I'm thinking specifically about The Giant's Call. The editing is just as precise as the cinematography and the directing. The fact that this film was cut down from a 2-hour and 45-minute initial cut and had multiple re-edits over the past year and still has near perfect moment-to-moment continuity and structural editing is simply incredible to me. Following the focus in a close-up shot reverse shot scene with camera movement will reveal just how painstakingly precise the shooting actually was. So I couldn't imagine taking out so much footage without disrupting the flow in a huge way. And the same is true of the film on a structural macro level. The pacing is another strength here, though it takes a while to get used to because, like the sound design, the edit uses contrast to enhance the viewing experience. An example is the slow, almost static opening shot feeling like something straight out of the final act of Abbas Kiarostami's career, abruptly cutting to a movement-based sequence with a decent amount of cuts. This approach creates a strange and unique atmosphere all on its own, further enhancing the fantasy, dreamlike setting. The acting is superb across the board. Everyone is fantastic, and while this is absolutely a career performance from Dev Patel, whose casting is further proof of the Christ parallel, the performance I found myself thinking about the most is Alicia Vikander's. She is essentially, at least in part, the Mary Magdalene figure in this story, and considering this specific take on the Christ figure, it can be argued that she's also the story's moral censor. And the way she balances that with the other aspects of her performance that I will not spoil, it's just something that you really have to see to believe. She is unspeakably great. Overall, The Green Knight has so much to offer. It is at once a beautifully constructed fantasy adventure film with wonderful allusions to the horror genre and a dense and richly thematic piece that rewards multiple viewings and active engagement. It is a film that feels alive and tactile, and I am completely in love with it. It feels like one of those movies that was always too good to be true, like Shane Carruth's A Topiary, Jodorowsky's Dune, or Zulawski's On the Silver Globe, that actually got made and released in its totality. It doesn't feel close to anything in American cinema right now. In fact, I thought about Hard to Be a God and the criminally underseen 2017 film November while watching it. Just two films that I absolutely love that you should seek out if you haven't already. I've already seen this film 3 times and I can't wait to see it again because The Green Knight is fantasy done right. Thanks for watching. I'm Lee, and I'm a fake critic.
Christ is born.